Happy New Year, everybody. Yeah, thanks for coming to the Luohan Webinar. So today we are very happy to have Peter Newberry. Professor Newberry is currently Associate Professor at Economics at the University of Georgia, Terry College of Business. Much of Professor Newberry's research is on the industrial organization of digital markets with an emphasis on issues that are unique to these markets. His work has been published in leading economics and marketing journals such as the Econometrica, the Rand Journal of Economics, the International Economic Review, and the Journal of Marketing Research. Today, interestingly, he's gonna also gonna analyze the change in the return policy in the TMO. And the title is The Impact of Return Policies in E-commerce. Yeah, Professor Newberry, the floor is yours.
All right, great. Thanks for coming, and thanks for the invitation. So this is a paper that has kind of been on the back burner for a while. My former grad student, Jalou, who's now at Xiamen University, is my co-author. And she collected this data for her job market paper. And then we kind of saw some interesting features outside of her job market paper that we wanted to study, but it's taken us a while to start getting the project off the ground. So this is actually the first time I presented, either of us have presented this in like a long form. So we're definitely interested to hear your feedback. So yeah, we're thinking about return policies in e-commerce. So I always put a lot of my papers are about e-commerce. So I put these motivation slide about growing importance of e-commerce as motivation. I'm sure I don't really need to do this for many of you, but of course, e-commerce is becoming more and more important. And this is the share of US sales that are retail sales that are through e-commerce. And we can see, after the pandemic, it's kind of settled in at around 14–15%. But it's been increasing steadily, and maybe we expect that to grow a little bit after this. So one of the things that e-commerce platforms or sellers or whatever have to do to compete with their offline counterparts is deal with the information issue. So this is kind of a common problem here, that the consumer can't touch or see or whatever the good before they buy it. So they have to have mechanisms that deal with the information issues. So things like ratings, product reviews, bestseller lists, these kind of things have been studied by myself and others. We're going to focus on the ability to return the product after you get it. So to be clear, I want to be clear up front. In this project, we're not really thinking about refunds versus replacement or whatever. We're just kind of blanketing everything in. The person didn't like the product, they either want a replacement or they want to get a refund. We're not deciphering between those two things. Okay, by the way, feel free to interrupt me with questions whenever you have them. Also, returns are pretty important. There's some survey evidence from ComScore, like, over half shoppers read the return policy. 55% of consumers dislike online shopping because of returns are hard. These are even back in 2012, so 10 years ago. So I'm sure this has become probably even more important. 15 to 40%, that's a big range of products bought online or returned, and 5% offline. So you can see this issue, how it kind of is maybe more important for online sellers. And then on the supply side, returns are really costly for sellers. You can see the amount it costs sellers. It was about 8% of all retail sales in 2015, and up to 2020, I found this estimate that reverse logistics, like how much it costs to send things back and stuff like that, is up to 550 billion in 2020. So despite this, as far as I can tell, that there's not a ton of research in either economics or marketing studying return policies. I mean, there's a little bit, but I would say it's probably understudied given these facts. So how are we going to think about returns? Well, on the demand side, how do we think return policies and returns impact the market? Well, on the demand side, we're thinking about two different effects. The first effect is pretty straightforward. It's providing insurance in a market where the product has unobserved quality ahead of time. So the consumer's insured against some sort of risk of getting a bad product. The second thing you could think is that variation in policies could provide a signal of quality. So if returns are costly to sellers, then there may be a separating equilibrium where good sellers who are unlikely to get to have returns are more likely to set a lenient policy, and kind of bad sellers or you know, I don't know, I put that in quotes, or maybe sellers with not as good of product, high quality of product, maybe set a more strict return policy. So we're not really thinking deep. So other people have studied the theory of this. We're not really thinking deep about the theory, but there could, the variation in return policies could represent a signal. Okay, so we're going to think about, on the demand side, those two effects. On the supply side, of course, the more returns there are, the higher cost it is to sellers. And actually, one thing that I didn't really think about before starting this project is, and what we kind of find is that actually having returns maybe gives sellers more pricing power. Okay, and I'll talk more about the intuition of that later. But the fact that there is the option returns maybe means sellers have more pricing power. So this is kind of I think a new thing studied in terms of returns that we're going to look at. Okay.
Excuse me.
Yep.
Hi, this is Yingju from Luohan. I have a question regarding the nature of those products. How you gonna deal with like different products by nature? The customer may value the return differently. Like for clothes, they want to try. They only know the quality after they try. But for other more standardized products, maybe this effect is.
I mean, this is a really good question. So the product market that we have data on is for tablets. So you'd imagine that there's probably not a lot of uncertainty in terms of the quality of tablets given the product characteristics. So in some sense, our data maybe isn't the best to study, you know, uncertainty, but we still see returns for our sellers. So it's just not as high as these numbers we post. You know, these numbers are what did I 15 to 40%. We see about 9% of products are returned. So the way we think about it is, you know, they're returned if there's something wrong with the product when you get it, like it's damaged or you get the wrong product. And I still think there's probably some uncertainty in terms of brands of tablets and stuff. There may be some, like, you know, kind of off niche brands that people buy and decide they don't really like it. But of course, you're right that if we did this with apparel or, you know, some other product category, we may get different answers, right? So so it's hard, I think, for us to make a huge general statement about all returns, but you know, we may be informed a little bit about other product categories. But it's a good question. Our product market may not be, I mean, in one sense, it's nice that we have a single product market, so we don't have to worry about this variation. But in another sense, maybe we don't have the perfect product market to answer this question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, but it's a great question. Okay, so what are we going to do? So we're going to study return policies using data from Tmall, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. We're going to quantify. So the first thing we're going to do is quantify the relative importance of these two aspects of the demand side, and we're going to answer how do firms value each component, signaling versus insurance. And then the second thing we're going to do is a counterfactual analysis of platform level return policies. So the idea is that if the platform sets a uniform return policy for all sellers, what are the outcomes? So what does this do? This eliminates signaling, right? That you can't, everyone looks the same ex ante after you make a uniform policy. And you could think that maybe you shift around the strictness or the leniency of the uniform policy, which will affect the market. So you can think of examples in practice. Amazon Fulfilled by Amazon, you know, sellers have to have a certain return policy. Even non-FBA sellers in Amazon have to have some return policy. And then in 2014, China the government passed a consumer protection policy about returns. You know, no questions asked, within 7 days you have to accept a return. So you could think this could be an analysis of a policy such as that too. Okay, how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to estimate a demand model that has a discrete choice demand model with the option to return. So we're going to account for both signaling and insurance. So the key to this is that we observe both purchases and returns and return policies. So you know, if you think about identification here, like we're going to be able to separate the signaling from insurance effects because we observe these two outcomes, both purchasing, and then when you get it, you know the quality, and then you decide to return it. So we're going to be able to see these two things very separately, and that's going to tell us something about signaling versus insurance. Okay, so after we estimate the demand model, we're going to estimate a supply model. So we're going to assume a static pricing model with returns. So what the key outcome of this is to quantify the costs of returns to sellers. So how expensive it is for sellers to process a return. So how we're going to identify this is covariation in return rate. So how often are products being returned, and seller prices. That is going to tell us something about how much those returns cost. Okay, and then we're going to move on to our analysis. I'm going to call this quantifying the signaling versus insurance. This is a quantification, keeping prices fixed, so like a partial equilibrium here. Then we're going to do some counterfactuals about uniform return policies. We're going to look at one where we ban returns altogether, and then two where they set a uniform kind of default policy. And then I write this bonus because it wasn't part of our objectives at the beginning, but we're going to demonstrate if we ignore returns, how it biases the model. So you could think about if you just write down a standard discrete choice model, ignoring this option to return the product afterwards, we're going to demonstrate how that biases estimates.
Okay. Can I ask you a quick question?
Yep.
Is there any special implication of this counterfactual analysis uniform ban on returns? Because I think pretty sure it's like a very low probability thing we're gonna see in the future.
Yeah, so I guess this could be considered also a quantification rather than a full policy analysis. But I do look at this as kind of like quantifying. Of course, the market's quite different, but if you think about it, probably 20 years ago when the internet started, there was probably very strict returns where basically no one, sellers didn't really accept returns all that much, or it was really costly. So you could think about it as maybe, looking at how the environment looked back then. But of course, probably didn't have as many sellers and stuff like that at that point. But you're right. This is more of a theoretical, I guess, theoretical bounding exercise. Don't really see that happening. But yeah, it is informative though, comparing the all-out ban to moving to a more lenient uniform policy. So that's kind of the primary kind of mechanism I'll show. Okay. But yeah, it's a good question. Okay. All right. So findings. So actually, I'm going to go with this last one first. We find that ignoring returns results in a price coefficient bias downwards and markups upwards. So if you think about it, when you ignore returns, so how do consumers respond to prices when there's returns, right? So they're probably not as price sensitive because they have the option to on the front end, right? They have the option to return on the back end. So they might not be as sensitive to prices on the front end. Okay, so if you ignore returns, right, and just estimate a standard discrete choice model, we're going to interpret that price insensitivity at the front end as, lack of sensitivity to prices, but it's really because consumers know they have the option to return afterwards. So that's why at the end of the day, if we ignore returns, we're going to get a price coefficient that's biased towards zero. It's going to look like consumers are less price sensitive than they actually are. And then that's going to show that markups are on the seller side, it's going to bias markups upwards. Okay. So I think that's a pretty interesting kind of straightforward result. So then onto the quantification, we say insurance accounts for about 80% of the value of the return policy to the consumers, and signaling doesn't provides only a small amount, maybe 20%-ish. So why do I think this is going on? Well, I think there's a lot of other signals on the platform, ratings, stuff like that. So maybe the return policy doesn't provide that much extra information. Uniform return policies. So again, signaling plays a small role in setting a uniform return policy. So more strict policy, we actually see that a strict return policy, even a ban, actually helps consumers in terms of surplus and hurts firms. So this is kind of counterintuitive. You think like setting a really strict return policy is bad for consumers, but what's the channel here? We actually see that it's a pricing channel, that when you ban returns, what happens Well, consumers are now more price sensitive, right? I talked about the price sensitivity on the front end. So you ban returns, consumers are more price sensitive. So firms don't have as much pricing power, okay? So they're gonna have to lower, when you ban returns, they're gonna be lowering prices, right? And they're gonna be competing harder with each other, which is actually gonna end up being good for consumers. The other angle that kind of why a ban on returns maybe helps consumers is because the firms actually pass through some of these return costs. Returns are really expensive for firms, and they pass through some of these costs to consumers. So at the end of the day, when you have a strict return policy, you're going to end up seeing lower prices, and that's going to outweigh any benefit from kind of like having the protection against risk. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting counterintuitive result, I think. Yep.
So would that imply that for new products that may not be well reviewed, the signaling impact would be higher? So if you have a return policy for a new product, would that make more sense for the signaling aspect?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So we actually find evidence of that, that the return policy. So yeah, we have to dig a little deeper into this, but with our in our preliminary data analysis, like the descriptive part of the paper, we actually do find evidence that the return policy is more impactful for new sellers than it is old sellers. We with that data, it's kind of hard to separate, because it could be that the insurance angle is more impactful for new sellers too. So with just that exercise, it's hard to separate those things. But my instinct is that yes, there is some sense that if we separated new and old sellers, we might see a more strong signaling effect for the new sellers. So we can certainly do some of that work later. But it's a good point. Yeah.
Oh yeah, can I ask you a question?
Yep.
About the lenient return policy will make the less price sensitive? Yeah. Right. Is that the theoretical result or your empirical result you find?
So it's that's a good question. So I haven't proven.
I think it's not that straightforward actually, right?
Yeah, I agree. So I haven't proven, and I don't think it's theoretically true under all parameters. I think so in this market, right, return uncertainty doesn't play a huge role because only 9% of the products are returned on average. So it's possible if you had a market where uncertainty played a lot bigger role, maybe maybe we wouldn't see these kind of counterintuitive results. And about the the price sensitivity, yeah, I haven't proven that it's true everywhere, but I have the same instinct as you that it's probably not true under all parameters. But it certainly is true in our with our estimates, right?
Okay.
But the intuition is that, like, it's kind of like a search model. The intuition is that, like, you're protected against risk up front, right? So you're going to be less price sensitive up front. And then it's costly for you to return on the back end, for consumers to return on the back end. So there may be some consumers who, like, are responding to lower prices by buying more upfront, and then are kind of stuck with the product afterwards because it's costly to return. So I don't know, intuitively to me, it seems to make sense that they'd be less price sensitive, but I don't have a good handle on whether that's true under all parameters.
Yeah. Okay, but this is like your estimation results, right?
Yeah, our estimation results, definitely it's true under there. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
Yep.
May I ask a question?
Yep.
Sorry. Hi, Peter. So it seems to me that the return policy is got to be an integral part of the platform policy. So essentially, it's very integral to the online model, right? Because, but the point here is that it should build the confidence of the buyers, and that it's going to encourage their consumption behavior because they are feel more secured. And that, from platform's point of view, that's going to improve significantly the size of the pie, or the activities, GMVs, whatever it is. And that is, I mean, if you look at China, it's been improved, like the online the e-commerce replacing the traditional offline retailing has been sweeping in many areas. It's kind of very dramatic. So I think all these different policies, including the return policy, probably play a very integral role in here. And if that improves the pie significantly, it's not immediately clear to me how it's going to reduce the profit of the firms.
Yeah, so this is a good point. So I think maybe this isn't exactly what you're saying, but this is how I would maybe put it is there's some dynamics at play here that like you're more likely to return to the platform if you don't get screwed over, right? And even at the seller level, maybe you're more likely to buy from a seller again. So yeah, we're ignoring any dynamics here. So in some sense, this is also kind of partial, I guess, equilibrium in that sense that there could be dynamics at play that overall, the more lenient the return policy is, consumers are more protected. They'll come back, and maybe there'll be feedback, and they'll keep coming back. So you're right. In some sense, we're only capturing kind of like a static dimension of this. But I do agree with that. Yeah.
So isn't that a bit unfortunate? Because to me, this probably is the biggest impact on the trading consumption activities online.
Yeah, but yeah, in some sense, like they're trading off, I guess. Here I'm showing there might be a short run kind of loss, but they're trading that off possibly with a long-term benefit. That we're not capturing here.
Really thinking about how you're going to capture this, because this is really the first order effect, right? It's like before you have a return policy, I'm positive, let's say, and after that, I'm positive that it's going to be double, triple, or even more the online consumption behavior. And that is probably the first order effect. I'm not precisely, I'm not sure about this.
Yeah, I mean, you need some kind of endogenous entry model of consumers here, I think. Yeah, where we don't have. So again, yeah, you're right. This is all caveated with this is a very short run analysis. But we're highlighting some other a dimension of what would happen with lenient. But you're right. This is certainly caveated by this is a short run thing that they may be trading off short run loss with long term benefit. Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
But my point is that this is firstly, you probably want to be clearer about what you're capturing.
Yeah.
And
that's a good point.
Second, I think it's because you're talking about its impact on firms, on this consumer surplus, but really let's say if you shut down the return policy, I think the biggest impact is not probably the thing I'm talking about. The biggest impact, I think, is going to probably the trading volume is going to be half or something like that. Those are things I think we want to talk about. Otherwise, it's quite partial to the point as it might be people might not capturing what's the most biggest, the first order effect. That's
point taken. I agree. But I will tell you, like, as we do find that, as you said, a more lenient return policy, it is helping sellers, which is going to help the platform because they have more pricing power, as you said, a more lenient return policy. But I do agree that maybe this short run that there is a very important effect on possible entry of and returning customers, some impact on volume in that way. But you're right. Yeah, point taken.
Right. Because this is my final sentence is because it's really making a scalable impact on all the firms, building a trust, building this is the dynamic kind of feedback, right? So this is really beneficial to all the firms. I think everything else is probably second order. You're talking about within this relative impact of the firms, of the ones that quality can signal versus other stuff like that. But really, because platform, its growth comes from its scalable impact, and this is one of them.
Yep. No, point taken. Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Okay. So data source. So we collect this data from Alibaba's Tmall. You guys know what that is. It's a big platform. So the return policies, it has, as far as we can tell, it has 3 dimensions: how long it takes to accept a return, who pays for it, and does there need to be a reason. So we're gonna have the default policy is 7 days. The buyer pays the return shipping, and the buyer can return for no reason. And then there is, like I said, there's this consumer protection law that sellers must accept a return for any reason within 7 days. It's kind of, reading around, it's kind of unclear whether that was really all that binding at that point. But at least this is, this is similar to the default return policies here. So our primary sample, so Xiaolu collected this for her job market paper way back when, but she scraped monthly information for each tablet listing between September. So we have 4 months of data between September and December of 2014. So we have quantity and prices for each seller tablet, kind of the typical product characteristics that you'd think about with a tablet. And then seller characteristics, what tier city they're in, how long they've been on the platform. That's what you say, age, total listings, ratings, and kind of a type. So whether they're national retailers versus local. And then the returns, we see the monthly return percentage across all products offered by the seller. And then some data on the total returns and returns for different reasons. At this point, we're not really using this variation in returns for different reasons. We could, but one issue with these data is in studying this is that make it maybe not be the perfect data is that besides being tablets, is that these are multi product sellers for the most part, and the return rates are across all their products. So in a sense that if they sell tablets and cell phones and this kind of stuff, the return rate that we see is the return rate across all the products and not just tablets. So there's not much we can do about this. So what we're assuming is that the return rate is the same across all product categories that a seller sells. These are electronics sellers mostly. So you could think they're mostly all selling electronic goods. So maybe it's not a crazy assumption that the return rate is similar across those products. It's not like they're selling clothes and tablets. That's a data issue that we can't really do much about, but we're just going to make the assumption that the return rate is the same across all product types. So the return rate we observe is the return rate for tablets. Okay, and then return policies, we hand collected each dimension of these 3 dimensions in the winter of 2017. So one thing you can see is this is about 3 years after the scrape of the data that we actually collected the return policies. This is because we didn't start thinking about this project until then. So there's a couple of issues with this collection, going through and collecting the return policies for each seller. Issue 1 is there's going to be missing data. So there's 2 reasons why there might be missing data. One is the seller doesn't list it on their page. So we're going to assume that if they didn't list it, it's going to be the default policy. Okay. There's also this issue that we collected the data, almost 3 years after we scraped the original data. So it could be that the sellers are no longer listed. So again, this is about 20% of the sellers. So we can do a couple things. I mean, right now we're assuming they have the default policy. Of course, we could lump them into the outside option, or we could do some robustness, assuming maybe some of them have a lenient policy. But it's hard to know what to do with these guys. So of course, the consumer protection law is the default policy. So maybe it's not crazy to assume these guys have the default return policy. But there's certainly some measurement error in our return policy data. And then there also could be the fact a seller may have changed their policy between when we collected the original data and when we collected the policy. Again, there's not much we can do about this. We're going to assume that the policy is the same. So we're going to actually define a binary variable that is, to simplify things in terms of the policy, we're going to say you're either a default seller or you set a more lenient policy. Okay, so we don't really see many people set a stricter policy. Again, the consumer protection law kind of restricts that. So what we're going to do is say, all right, you either set the default policy or you set something more lenient in terms of how many days you accept returns, whether or not you pay for it. So that's where we're going to define a lenient seller versus a default seller. Okay. All right, just to take a look at the data a little bit. So these are the statistics in terms of performance and seller characteristics if you have a default policy, if you have a lenient policy, and across all sellers. So, I mean, there's not a ton to talk about here, except for the fact that one thing you can see is the return rate here. The average return rate for sellers with a lenient policy is 7%, where the return rate with sellers with a default policy is 9%. So here you're seeing maybe some evidence of a signaling effect that it's actually sellers who have a more lenient return policy, except more returns, are actually getting fewer returns. Okay. The other kind of thing I want to point out here is that if you look at the ratings, so we're going to split sellers into highly rated, medium rated, and low rated, kind of based on the distribution of ratings. And you can see here that on the lenient policy, you're more likely to be a highly rated seller than conditional on being a default policy. So again, this is not like 100%. There's a lot of stuff going on here, but this may be evidence that like kind of better sellers are setting a more lenient policy. Okay, so more higher quality sellers are selling a lenient policy. Prices are a little cheaper for lenient. They're selling a little less. Here's just the distribution of return rates. So you can see the average is about 9. You can see it's kind of centered pretty low, but has a long tail here. Here's the product characteristics by policy. The main point of showing this is the product characteristics that don't differ that much by whether you're a lenient or a default seller. The places where they do differ is you can see the storage and the memory is a bit different. There's some brand variation. So like, a higher percentage of sellers with a lenient policy are Teclist and Lenovo versus their default policy. But for the most part, the product characteristics are pretty similar across the two types of sellers. So they're not really selling different tablets. Okay, so we're just use the data to provide some preliminary evidence of the effect of return policies. So one thing we're going to do up front, just to kind of so we're using the same data we use in the structural model to do this, is we're going to aggregate to the seller level. There's 2 reasons we're going to do that, seller month level. 2 reasons we're going to do that is the level of the returns and the return policy are at the seller month level. So they're not at the product level, right? So we're going to aggregate across products within a seller. And this reduces the number of zeros. So I mean, with the discrete choice model, zeros are a problem. So this reduces the number of zeros if we aggregate everything to the seller level. So we're going to create like a standardized product for each seller in each month, okay, using a share within seller share weighted product and price. Okay, so we're going to aggregate everything to seller month level. And then we're going to look at a few relationships. I think today I'm only going to show you that this first one is the relationship between purchases. So like the front end buying and a lenient return policy. Okay, and then we also look at returns in a lenient policy and prices and returns. So how are we going to do this? We're going to run a regression of log quantity of seller S in month T on product characteristics, seller characteristics, prices, and whether or not the seller has a lenient policy. Okay, we're going to define actually the seller age based on whether you're younger, if you've been on the platform less than a year. So that variable is going to become important here in a second. So when we just run a OLS regression, we get a negative price elasticity of like -1.4. Lenient policy is positive and insignificant. We do an IV regression where we use a share of listings, tablets versus cell phones for rival sellers. And so this is kind of like a BLP IV. You're using information about products from rival sellers. And we get a price elasticity of around 3, but then a negative policy coefficient. So this is against what we think that like the more lenient the policies, it should increase demand, right? So what do? We now add an interaction between whether or not you're new to the platform or whether you're old and a lenient policy. Okay, so we can see that actually this is the effect of a lenient policy for new sellers. We see that as positive and significant. Old sellers, I mean, if you get the marginal effect of lenient policy for old sellers, it's kind of near 0. So it's a little negative, which is not really in line with intuition, but we can reasonably say that might be 0. So it looks like a lenient policy only impacts demand for new sellers. So again, this could be either because it's a signaling effect, like there's not a lot of quality signals for new sellers, or it could be that because there's more uncertainty about new sellers, that actually the insurance effect is actually stronger too. Buyers are more protected against new sellers. Okay, so then we just do a specification where we just include the interaction between lenient policy and new, because at the end of the day, this is what we're going to end up doing in the structural model, is saying that you're a lenient seller if you're new and you have a lenient policy. Okay, so you can see that things don't change. This effect doesn't change that much here. So these last 3 regressions are just showing you evidence that dropping the sellers that exited between when we collected the Q and P data versus the return policy data, if we drop all those sellers, these are the results. And again, the price coefficient changes a little bit, or the elasticity changes a little bit, but the qualitative results don't change that much. So this gives us confidence that what we do with these exited sellers maybe doesn't have a huge impact. Okay, so evidence that lenient policy increases demand on the front end for new sellers. So I'm going to skip these other regressions in the interest of time, but to summarize, we do see this positive relationship of purchases and the policy. When we look at the number of returns in the policy, we actually don't see a significant effect. And the reason for this is because the relationship between returns and a return policy, it works in 2 different directions, right? The more lenient you are, conditional on buying the thing, there's going to be more returns, right? But also, the more lenient you are, it's a signal of higher quality, which is going to be less returns. So these signaling and the insurance effect work in opposite directions in terms of the relationship between the return policy and the number of returns. So we get an insignificant effect there, but it's not all that surprising because those effects are working in different directions. And then if you look at returns and prices, kind of like a reduced form of the supply model, we do see a positive coefficient on the number of returns on prices, but it's insignificant. But again, we're not controlling for the interaction between demand, supply, returns, policy, and prices. So this is kind of what brings us to the need to estimate a structural model. Okay, so let's see, I have 20 minutes left. Okay, so the model, I mean, you can kind of probably guess how this is going to go. So consumers are going to purchase a tablet from a seller who we don't know their quality, and there's an unknown match value. Okay, so what do I mean by that match value? We have a vertical component and then a horizontal component that the consumer doesn't know. Okay, so the tablet, you could think vertical component is if it shows up broken or the wrong tablet. Horizontal component is, this tablet is too big, right? I don't like big tablets or small tablets or whatever. I guess that would be known ahead of time, but you could think of a horizontal characteristic versus a vertical characteristic. So consumers are going to form belief about this vertical component from the ratings and the return policy. So this is the signaling effect. And then this match value is going to be an idiosyncratic shock. This is like the search, like if you guys are familiar with search literature, this is a lot like the search literature. Once the consumer receives the tablets, they learn their true utility for it, and then they can return it, but it costs, there's some cost of returning, monetary or hassle or whatever you want to call it. So this cost is going to be a function of the return policy. So how hard it is for a consumer to return is going to be a function of the return policy. This is the insurance effect of the return. So we have the insurance effect here and the signaling effect here. Okay, on the seller side, we're not going to model the return policy decision. We're going to assume that happened ahead of time, you know, before our data was processed. But we're going to, you know, with this signaling effect, you know, in the background, we think that sellers are setting this policy based on their quality, and then we're going to assume sellers set set static prices based on their expected demand and expected returns. Okay, so I might try to run through this fairly quickly, but so consumer eyes ex post indirect utility. So if they buy the tablet, this is the this is the utility they're going to get, right? So it's made up of their preferences for product characteristics, disutility of price, and then this CAC tilde plus new K is the seller quality, the revealed seller quality once they buy the product. This eta is a shock that they know before they buy the product, and this epsilon is a shock they don't know before they buy their product. Okay, so these two, CAC and new, are unobservable to the econometrician and the consumer, but observable to the consumer, and eta is observable to the consumer. Epsilon is not observable to the consumer ex ante. Okay, we're gonna make an assumption about how consumers form their belief. We're gonna simplify things and just say they form their belief. There's some linear function of seller characteristics and the policy and an unobservable. Okay, so this thing right here, this is their belief about quality. The new K is something that's revealed after the consumer buys it. So this new K is the difference between their belief and the realized seller quality. Okay. All right, so then I keep jumping ahead. So ex ante utility is, so before they buy the thing, their expected utility is going to be based on this CAC tilde, their belief, and then, you know, they're going to take an expectation over this epsilon that they don't know. All right, so that's the purchase value, the purchase utility. How about the return utility? We're going to need to think about the utility they get from making a return. So we're going to assume that it's, you know, there's a benefit to the return. So this benefit could mean, like, what else do you get? What's the next, the thing that you get after you return? Okay, so it can be a function of product characteristics or seller characteristics. And then this is going to be net of the cost of returning, and the cost of returning could be a function of seller characteristics, product characteristics, but it's also going to be a function of the leniency of the return policy. Okay, we can't separate all these things, so we're just going to parameterize the net utility of returning as a function of product characteristics, seller characteristics, the policy, and some unobservable that's revealed after purchasing, and a shock, consumer level shock that's also revealed after purchasing. Okay, I know there's a lot going on here. I'm going kind of quick. So the consumer is going to return the product if their utility from returning after they get it, their ex post utility from returning after they receive it, is greater than their ex post utility of keeping it. Okay, so one thing we can't separate is this new K, right? This is something that's revealed to the consumer after they purchase the product. And this new R, which is also something that's revealed about the return utility, right? We can't separate those two things. So we're just going to lump those all into one seller level unobservable. So at the end of the day, we're going to have one seller level unobservable on the purchase decision, this fee, and then one seller level unobservable on the return decision, okay, which is this new. Okay, so if we assume these epsilon R and epsilon K are IID extreme value, then we can write down the inclusive value of buying from that seller ex ante. So before, when the consumer is deciding what to buy, right, they're going to take into account the utility they're going to get if they keep it, their expected utility they're going to get if they keep it, and the expected utility they're going to get if they return it. So this is the inclusive value of that decision, right? And then we're going to add a shock to the end of this. This shock is, you know, just randomness in before your buy decision, that doesn't carry over to the return decision. Importantly, though, we do have this ADA shock that carries over from your buy decision to your return decision. So there is some unobservable thing at the consumer level that makes the consumer buy up front and then maybe not return. You know, they have higher preferences for something, it's less likely they're going to return it when they get it. Okay, but this upsilon, I think that's what that is. This upsilon is just randomness in the purchase decision. Okay, so then the purchase decision looks like this. The return decision looks like this. Going a little quick here, but so what can we do then? Well, we can form the market share of products kept, right? So what's the market share of products kept? Well, integration across consumers, probability you purchase it, probability you keep it, right? So conditional on ADA, these things are independent, right? If you look at the formulation, conditional on ADA, these two things are independent, right? Or conditional on the ADA and the other covariates, these things are independent. So you can just multiply them by each other to get the probability a individual consumer buys and keeps something. We integrate that over I, we get the share of keep. Okay, the share of return is the converse, probability you buy it, probability you return it. Okay, so this is the total out of all the products in the market, what's the share of returning. Okay, on the supply side, so the profit is the number of people in the market, right? This is the share of people who bought it, share of return times price. I'm going to talk about this in a second. This is the share of people return times, this is the cost it takes the seller to process a return. And then this is the marginal cost of the product. Okay, so here you can see we could write this profit function in a lot of different ways. The assumptions we're making here about what happens when you return a product, you keep the price, right? Here, you're keeping the price even when they return the product, and you're not paying the marginal cost. Okay, so you're recouping the entire marginal cost. So again, we could make different assumptions here. We could say they don't get any of the price when the product's returned, or, you know, and then they lose all the marginal costs. So we can do a bunch of different things here. At this point, this is, you know, what we've estimated is a model where they keep the price and they don't recoup, they recoup all the marginal costs. What that's going to do actually is just make this interpretation of K different, right? So, or kappa, sorry, this kappa different. So this kappa, given our assumptions on the profit function, is going to include any processing costs of a return, any non-recouped marginal cost, right? So if you get the product back, you know, some non-recoup marginal cost, any cost of replacement. So if you have to send a new tablet to the buyer, you're going to have to pay some marginal cost, and any possible refund you're offering the consumer. So this kappa is actually going to include a lot of stuff. So it's not clear to us like what the best assumption to make on the front end here about, you know, how returns, like, you know, what happens to price, what happens to marginal costs when a consumer returns. But we can do it in a bunch of different ways. It's just that we don't observe these different outcomes, whether the thing is, you know, issued a replacement or whether they just get a full refund. We can't separate those stories. Okay, and at the end of the day, we're going to assume the return cost is the same for all sellers. We've tried to estimate heterogeneity on that dimension. It becomes really difficult. These estimates get super noisy. So, you know, we're going to keep trying to add some heterogeneity at the seller level in their return costs. But right now, we're just estimating a uniform. Okay, so let me. So if we take the first order condition, I think this is an important point. So I do want to get to it. So if we take the first order condition, our pricing first order condition is going to look like this. Okay, so this is a static pricing model where this lambda is what I'm going to call direct marginal cost pass-through. So I'm using pass-through really loosely here because pass-through is not just this direct, like, you know, it's a feedback mechanism of when costs go up, what happens to prices. But I'm going to call this the direct marginal cost pass-through. So this lambda, if costs go up, right, then prices are going to go up by more than 1. Okay, all else equal. So this lambda R is return cost pass through. So if the cost of returns goes up, how much are we going to pass through to consumers in terms of prices? And this CAC is kind of our typical markup term. And I'll show you that in a second. If you think about writing down the kind of static first order condition in a market without returns, we have this markup term here. Okay, and we're going to parameterize cost to be a function of marginal cost to be a function of product characteristics and seller characteristics. Okay, so I did want to talk about this a little bit. So like the kind of no returns first order condition looks like this. Like if you wrote down a kind of a regular discrete choice model and you did a static pricing first order condition, it would look like this, where you have the cost, marginal cost of the product, and then this markup term, where the markup term is the share over the derivative of the share with respect to price. Okay, the price sensitivity. Okay, if you compare this to what we have, so there's 3 different things that are different. One is this, we have this like, you know, direct marginal cost pass through that's greater than 1. Here it's equal to 1. So this is really about our assumptions about what happens with prices and marginal cost. It's because sometimes you get, you know, in our model, the way we wrote down the profit is you always get to keep the price and you recoup all your marginal costs. So when costs go up a little bit, you're going to pass through more of those costs to the consumer. So this, I don't find this part all that interesting, right? Because this is kind of a function of our assumptions of the profit function. However, the 2 interesting bits are we have this additional return cost pass through. So the fact that, you know, the cost of the seller goes up and you're going to increase prices because they're returning because returns are costly. Okay, so there's that bit. The other bit is this CAC. So if you look at it in our model, this is the share kept plus share return. So this is kind of the total people who purchased up front, and then the derivative of that with respect to prices. So if you think intuitively, again, this is the thing I haven't proven theoretically, but if you think intuitively, the numerator of this, if you had a model without returns, and then you have a model with returns, you'd think that all else equal, when you introduce returns, well, the share of all else equal, a share of a seller is going to be higher, right? That you introduce returns, they're going to have a higher share, maybe. You know, I don't know that for sure, but the more interesting part is the denominator. Like this is just sensitivity to prices on the front end, right? Compared to a standard model. So my intuition says that consumers, because they're protected against risk, are going to be less sensitive on the front end of buying the product. So this new denominator is going to be smaller. Okay, so that intuition tells us that this CAC, right, is going to be a more negative number than it is in the standard model. So the markups are actually going to be higher. Okay, so this is that dimension I was talking about earlier that I think is kind of new, that because consumers, at least in our estimates, are less price sensitive, the seller's going to be able to set higher prices. Okay. Oh shoot. Sorry. Okay. What do I have? I have about 6 minutes left. Okay. So I'm not going to talk about estimations. Actually, pretty easy. So, and I'm not going to. There's not much to get into there, but I do want to show you the estimates and then maybe the results of the one counterfactual. So here are the estimates. We have the full model here. Product characteristics. So this is the preferences. Seller characteristics. This is going to be like signaling, right, on this side, and then these are the return preferences. So this is going to be so to interpret these, it's saying what happens to the value of making a return. So a positive coefficient here means that you're going to return it more often. A negative coefficient means you're going to return it less. So a positive coefficient could be it reduces return costs or increases the return benefit. So what do we see here? Well, the price coefficient, it's not significant, but it's I guess borderline maybe, but if you calculate the elasticities, it's actually pretty similar to the reduced form model I showed you. We get elasticities between 3 and 4. So I'm confident that's probably the right estimate. The product characteristics, the signs are all pretty they make sense. Not many of them are significant, but we do get the right signs on these characteristics. So kind of the important bit here. Why does this keep jumping around? Sorry. Okay, so the important bit here is, so these are the learning, these seller characteristics down here would be the learning effects. Okay, so what do we see? We see sellers with a national presence and sellers with high ratings have have higher demand on the front end. So this, and it's significant. So this is evidence that consumers are learning from that. The leniency, the policy variable, we find is positive, but it's not significant. So, there is this positive effect that it looks like, sellers who have a lenient policy up front have more demand, but that's not significant. If we turn to the return preferences, we actually see the leniency of a seller increases the number of returns, and it's significant. Okay, so this is evidence of the insurance effect, that the more lenient you are, the more returns you're going to have, right? And this is positive. So we take this, we interpret this as the leniency is lowering the cost to consumers to return the item. Okay, so we have a kind of significant insurance effect, but positive but insignificant signaling effect. The one, yep.
I'm sorry. Yeah, but the insurance effect will also increase the total demand. No?
Yeah, exactly. So both of them are going to increase total demand, right?
Right.
And then, yeah, exactly. So yeah, maybe I misspoke there. It's going to increase the number of returns, but it's also going to increase the demand up front. So in net, it's actually going to increase demand overall. Yeah. Okay, so then when you ignore returns, right, what happens? Well, the price coefficient gets lower. Okay, again, this is my intuition up front that we're going to interpret insensitivity to prices as the price coefficient when really it's because they're protected. And then you can see all the other preferences are underestimated, not all of them, but most of them are also underestimated too. So this is a similar intuition that we're going to be interpreting this kind of insensitivity to, ratings as people don't care about ratings, but it's really because they're protected when they're protected via insurance. Okay. Okay, so I have 2 minutes. So there's some results. So the main thing on the supply side is so this is going to look big, but I'll explain why it's big in a second. The return cost is $260 to process a return for a seller. So why is this so big? Well, again, our return cost includes any lost marginal cost, any replacement value, and any refund you have to issue. So in essence, this is saying that, like, on average, sellers who process a return have to replace the product. So they have to buy a whole new one, or they have to pay marginal costs again and give it to the consumer. So so it looks high on the surface, but I actually think this seems pretty reasonable, that each return, basically a seller kind of has to give a new product to the buyer. Okay, so I have 1 minute. So let me just show you the kind of main counterfactual result. So this is a lot here, so I'm just going to try to point out the important things. So what we're doing in this first column right here, this insurance no signaling, so we're banning returns altogether. It's removing any insurance effect and any signaling effect. Okay. The third column here, fourth column, is if we did that with fixed pricing. Okay. So what do we see? Well, kind of the main takeaways here is when you fix the prices and you ban returns, that's going to be worse for consumers. Right? If the firms are not allowed to adjust prices and you ban returns, that's bad for consumers, good for firms. Why is it bad for consumers? Well, of course, you no longer have the option to return the product, so this uncertainty is costly. And for firms, it's good because you're not processing any more returns, right? However, if you allow firms to adjust prices, now we see that it's actually good for consumers and slightly bad for firms. Not that bad for firms, but actually good for consumers. So what's going on here? Well, if you look at the pricing, so you can see prices go up. If you look at, the ban on prices, sellers have to reduce their prices, right? If you compare here to here, all sellers are reducing their prices. And if you look at the markups here, you can see the markup is much lower, the 0.31, than the markup in the observed. And you can see consumers, the elasticity of demand is lower as well when you ban returns. So the mechanism here is what I've been talking about, that banning returns actually gives firms less pricing power. So the last thing I'll show here, I'm over time, but instead, if we set all sellers have the default policy, right? If we move from a complete ban to the default policy, what do we see? Well, we see consumer surplus going down and profit going up slightly. So why is consumer surplus going down? Again, it's this pricing mechanism that the more lenient the policy is, right, the higher, geez, my computer is just jumping around, the higher the markups can be, right? And this term, this markup hour, this is our CASI term, or Chi term, right? You can see that it's $50 here and $45 here. So again, the leniency of the return policy is actually giving the firms, the sellers, more pricing power. Okay, so I'll just conclude since I'm out of time. So we estimated, so one thing I did want to say here is we could try to set an even more lenient policy. So like if we keep going more lenient, it might be the case that eventually it's good for consumers, right? I haven't proven this theoretically, but I think like the more lenient you get, there is going to be this trade-off, and eventually the pricing power is not going to outweigh the protection. Okay. The problem with doing that in a counterfactual sense is, as I set the policy more lenient and more lenient, sellers, I can't solve for a pricing equilibrium because there's a bunch of sellers who don't want to exist anymore. It's the more lenient you get, there's a bunch of sellers that want to exit. We haven't written down an entry and exit model, but you can't solve for the equilibrium fixing the firms the more lenient you get. All right. So there's kind of, this trade-off here. Okay, I'm going to conclude, quickly. We estimated demand and supply with returns. We found that more lenient policies can actually do harm. And important, we talked about this earlier, important caveat is that this is a short run analysis. In the long run, of course, there could be some market responses. So we have a couple things to do, but open questions. I just talked about this. Under what conditions would a lenient policy actually be beneficial to consumers? Because I don't think what we're showing is a theoretical result that it's always bad for consumers. I think there's some markets where it could be good. And then this idea of entry and exit is I think, interesting. Okay, I will stop there. I'm over time. Oh, I can't hear you.
Oh yeah, sorry. I actually have a small question.
Yep.
So I think it's interesting that you propose a new mechanism that with a lenient return policy, they can increase the market power, the seller market power, so they can actually increase the price.
Mm-hmm.
So their profit will increase, right?
Yeah, the more lenient the profit goes up, even though there's a trade-off for firms, right? They're going to be paying return costs the more lenient they get, but then there's also this market power effect. So again, this is not clear to me that this eventually it wouldn't be bad for sellers to do more and more lenient, but within our little framework, it's good for sellers because they have more pricing power. Yeah. So
that's like even without this demand growing effect, because you didn't consider this growing demand, right? In the model.
Yeah,
it's kind of interesting because you see a lot of in Amazon whenever they force these free returns for the sellers, you see a lot of the complaint from the sellers. We are suffering.
Yeah, so it's a good point. I mean, again, there could be a lot of heterogeneity in this too. In terms of so like I said, once you get to a certain point leniency, there's some sellers that actually it doesn't work for them anymore. So there's certainly some sellers that get hurt. I did show that if you can see like the sellers that set a lenient policy here, their profit goes from like 14,000 to 6,000. So those sellers are hurt, but on net, the sellers are better off because the guys who set the default policy end up being better off. Is that right? Oh no, between here and here, I guess. But here, okay. So the more lenient you get here, all the sellers are better off. But I guess it's not clear to me that if you keep going more lenient, what would happen? Right. I think there's some heterogeneous effects that maybe some sellers would go out of business once you get too lenient. So my suspicion is those are the sellers that are complaining.
Okay, yeah, that's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any questions to the speaker? Yeah, if there's no, maybe we can wrap it up. And thank you very much, Professor Newberry. Yeah, I think it was really interesting and also very related to business. Practices.
Yeah, I appreciate it, and thanks for all the questions. Good things to think about that we have to address for sure.
Okay, yeah. Also, thank you to the audience for participation. Yeah. So see you next time.
Okay, thanks.